The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a long day filled with the endless noise of life. Jacob sat alone at the edge of his couch, the soft hum of the TV in the background playing a show he wasn't watching. His mind was somewhere else. It had been a week since the abduction papers were finalized, and tomorrow was the big day. Tomorrow, he would become the father of 5 little girls. 5 sisters who, against all odds, had stayed together in a foster system that wasn't kind to sibling groups. It wasn't something Jacob had planned for his life. He had been living a pretty average one, balancing a steady job, a cozy home, and memories of a past he didn't talk about much. Losing his wife to cancer years ago had left a void, a silence that not even his small circle of friends could fill. He had thought of starting over, maybe dating again, but nothing ever felt right. Then he stumbled across their story. The photo was small and grainy, tucked into a sidebar on a website he'd been scrolling mindlessly. 5 young girls dressed in mismatched clothes, standing close together with hesitant smiles. The caption read, "Sisters seeking forever home, will not be separated." Jacob had stared at that photo for longer than he cared to admit. There was something about their faces, something that tugged at his chest in a way he couldn't explain. He learned that their names were Amani, Zola, Nlaya, Imani, and Tay, ages ranging from 2 to 10. Their foster parents had done what they could, but the system was running out of options to keep them together, and Jacob, for reasons that still baffled him, decided he couldn't let that happen. The adoption process had been grueling. Background checks, interviews, home inspections. Every step of the way, Jacob had questioned if he was enough. Could he, a single man with no parenting experience, really take on this responsibility? But every time doubt crept in, he thought of those 5 faces. He thought of how it must feel to be passed from house to house, never knowing if he'd wake up to the same people. He couldn't let them go through that anymore. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the agency early, nervous energy coursing through him. He smoothed his shirt for the 5th time, his mind racing with thoughts of how this meeting would go. When the girls were finally brought in, his breath caught. They were even smaller than he had imagined, their eyes wide and cautious as they shuffled into the room holding hands. "Hi," Jacob said, his voice softer than he expected. "I'm Jacob. I guess I'm your dad now." The youngest, Tay, peeked out from behind her sisters and gave a shy wave. The eldest, Amani, studied him with a protective gaze, as if assessing whether this man was truly worthy of their trust. Jacob didn't blame her. Trust wasn't given freely, it was earned. The weeks that followed were chaotic in the best way. The house, once so quiet, now echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the occasional sibling squabble. Jacob learned quickly that parenting wasn't just about providing, it was about showing up. It was staying up late to soothe nightmares, learning how to braid hair from YouTube tutorials, and figuring out why Zola refused to eat vegetables unless they were cut into stars. It was hard, exhausting work, but Jacob felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. But then strange things started happening. Small, unexplainable things. It began with the lights in the girls' room flickering at odd intervals, even after he had an electrician check the wiring. Then there were the times he'd find objects moved in the house, keys that weren't where he left them, toys that seemed to rearrange themselves. At first, he chalked it up to his own forgetfulness or the boundless energy of 5 children. One night, though, he woke to a sound that made his heart pound. It was faint, like a hum, but it felt unnatural. He followed the noise to the girls' room, pushing the door open slowly. Inside, he found all 5 of them sitting in a circle on the floor, their hands clasped tightly together, their eyes closed. "Amani," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment, Jacob swore they weren't her eyes at all. They seemed to glow faintly in the dark, like embers in a dying fire. The other girls looked up too, their expressions unreadable. "We didn't mean to wake you, Daddy," Amani said softly, her voice carrying an edge of something Jacob couldn't place. Before he could respond, the youngest, Tay, whispered, "It's almost time." Time for what, Jacob asked, his throat dry. The girls exchanged a glance, their small faces filled with a wisdom far beyond their years. Amani finally stood, stepping forward and placing a hand on Jacob's arm. "You'll see," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Soon." Jacob felt a chill run through him as he looked into her eyes, those eyes that now seemed so foreign yet familiar. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Jacob didn't sleep that night. After leaving the girls' room, he paced the living room, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to ask, let alone answer. What had he just witnessed? Was it some sort of game? A dream, maybe? But no, it had felt too real. The hum, the strange glow in their eyes, the cryptic words. His hand shook slightly as he poured himself a glass of water in the dim kitchen light. He tried to rationalize it. Kids have imaginations, he told himself. Maybe they were playing some kind of make-believe. But even as he thought it, he knew it didn't feel right. There was something about the way Amani had looked at him, like she knew something he didn't, like she was waiting for him to figure it out. The next morning, the house was alive with the usual chaos. Tay was singing a nonsensical song at the breakfast table while Naya argued with Zola about whose turn it was to sit next to Jacob. Amani was quiet, as she often was, helping Imani tie her shoes near the front door. Everything seemed normal, but Jacob couldn't shake the lingering unease from the night before. Amani, he called softly as the younger girls ran off to the living room, leaving their cereal bowls half-eaten. She looked up, her expression guarded but curious. About last night, he began, searching for the right words. What were you girls doing? That. Circle. Our eyes darted to the side as if weighing how much to tell him. It's just something we do sometimes, she said simply. But why? And what do you mean when you said, it's almost time? Amani hesitated, her small shoulders tensing. You'll understand soon, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, before he could press further, she added, can we go to the park today? Jacob opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the question caught him off guard. He nodded slowly. Yeah, we can go to the park, he said, letting the subject drop for now. The park was a welcome distraction. The girls loved it there, especially Tay, who spent nearly an hour chasing bubbles Jacob had blown for her. Nia and Zola raced each other across the grass, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Even Amani seemed to relax, sitting on a bench next to Jacob while Imani played on the swings. You're good at this, Imani said suddenly, her voice doleful. Jacob turned to her, surprised. At what? Being a dad, she said, glancing up at him. Most people don't really try with us. They just give up. Her words hit Jacob harder than he expected. Well, I'm not most people, he said firmly. She smiled faintly, but there was something sad in her eyes. I know, she said. That's why they picked you. Jacob frowned. Who's they? Amani didn't answer. Instead, she stood and ran to join her sisters, leaving Jacob sitting on the bench, more confused than ever. That night, Jacob sat at his computer after the girls had gone to bed, searching for answers. He typed in phrases like children glowing eyes, strange behavior in siblings, and even paranormal activity in adopted kids. Most of what came up was either nonsense or horror stories he didn't want to believe could be real. But one thread caught his attention. A forum post titled Adopted Kids Acting Strange. Anyone else experience this? He clicked on it, skimming through the responses. Most of them were dismissive or unhelpful, but one stood out. Sometimes kids come with stories bigger than we can understand. Pay attention to what they don't say as much as what they do. Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Pay attention to what they don't say, the phrase stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. What weren't the girls telling him? The days that followed only deepened the mystery. More strange occurrences began to pile up. The girls seemed to know things they shouldn't, like the time Zola casually mentioned a thunderstorm hours before it appeared, despite the clear morning sky. Or when Imani found Jacob's missing wedding ring in the backyard, buried under a patch of dirt she'd been playing in. He hadn't even told them it was lost. And then there were the moments when the house felt different. It wasn't something Jacob could put his finger on, but sometimes the air felt heavier, almost charged, like static before a lightning strike. He'd catch glimpses of the girls whispering in corners, their heads bent close together, stopping abruptly whenever he entered the room. One evening, as he tucked Tay into bed, she grabbed his hand and held it tightly. Daddy, she asked, her voice small and serious. What is it, sweetie? Do you believe in magic? Jacob blinked, caught off guard. I don't know, he said carefully. Why do you ask? Because, she said, her eyes wide and earnest. Sometimes things happen that don't make sense, but they're still real. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. What kind of things? He asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. Tay shrugged, her little fingers still clutching his. Just things, she said, her gaze drifting to the window, like when the stars talk to you. Jacob felt the air leave his lungs. The stars talk to you, he repeated, trying to keep his tone light. Tay nodded. Not just me. They talk to all of us. But they talk to Amani the most. She listens better. Jacob sat there, unable to speak, as Tay yawned and snuggled under her blanket. Within minutes, she was asleep, a tiny hand still wrapped around his. He stayed there for a long time, staring out the window at the night sky, his mind racing. What was happening in his home? What was happening to his daughters? And most importantly, what did it mean for him and for them? Jacob knew one thing for certain. Whatever was going on, it wasn't something he could ignore. The answers were out there, waiting for him to find them. He just didn't know if he was ready for what they might reveal. The following morning, Jacob woke up feeling a strange sense of determination. He didn't know what answers he was looking for or even where to start, but he couldn't keep brushing off the odd things happening in his home. He had 5 little girls depending on him, and he needed to understand what was going on, no matter how unsettling it was. The day began like any other. The girls clambered into the kitchen for breakfast, arguing over who got the last slice of toast, while Tay tried to sneak syrup onto her scrambled eggs. Jacob forced himself to act normal, even as his mind swirled with questions. Amani, as usual, was the quietest of the group. She sat at the table with her hands folded neatly, watching her sisters with a faint smile. "Girls," Jacob said casually, leaning against the counter, "have any of you felt anything strange lately? Like, I don't know, maybe something you can't explain?" The room went silent. 4 pairs of eyes darted toward Amani, who stayed perfectly still. Jacob's stomach twisted as he realized the question had landed exactly where he feared it would. "Why do you ask, Daddy?" Amani said, her tone measured. I've noticed a few things," he admitted, trying to keep his voice light. "Like the lights flickering, or how you seem to know things before they happen. Is there something I should know?" Amani's gaze didn't waver. "Would you be scared if there was?" she asked softly. The question caught Jacob off guard. He hesitated, not wanting to say the wrong thing. "I don't think so," he said finally. "I just want to understand." Amani's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at her sisters again, and something unspoken passed between them. Naya looked down at her plate, Zola fidgeted with her fork, and Tay clung to Imani's arm. "It's not bad," Imani said after a long pause, "but it's different." Jacob crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "Different how?" Before Imani could answer, a loud knock echoed through the house. The sudden noise made all the girls jump, and Jacob frowned as he stood. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Stay here," he said, heading toward the front door. When he opened it, he found a woman standing on the porch. She was tall and imposing, with sharp features and a presence that filled the space around her. She wore a dark suit that looked out of place in their quiet neighborhood, and her eyes were piercing as they locked onto his. "Mr. Jacob Walker?" she asked, her voice crisp and professional. "Yes," Jacob replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" "My name is Ms. Albright. I work with a specialized agency that monitors unique adoption cases," she said, pulling a badge from her pocket. "I'd like to speak with you about your daughters." Jacob's grip on the door tightened. "What do you mean, unique?" Ms. Albright's expression didn't change. "May I come in?" Jacob hesitated, glancing back toward the kitchen where the girls were still seated. "The girls are here," he said, his voice low. "I know," Ms. Albright replied. "That's why I'm here." Reluctantly, Jacob stepped aside to let her in. He led her to the living room, keeping one eye on the kitchen doorway. The girls hadn't moved, but he could feel their eyes on him. "What's this about?" he asked, sitting across from Ms. Albright. She set her briefcase on the coffee table and opened it, pulling out a thin folder. "Your daughters are part of a very rare case," she began. "You may have noticed anomalies in their behavior." Jacob's chest tightened. "What kind of anomalies?" "Unusual knowledge, heightened awareness, unexplained phenomena," Ms. Albright said, her tone clinical. "These are common traits in cases like theirs." Jacob shook his head, trying to process what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" "They're just kids." "They're extraordinary kids," Ms. Albright corrected, "and they're not like other children. Their origins are complicated." Jacob felt his pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" Ms. Albright leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It means that their biological history isn't entirely human." The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Jacob stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or tell him this was some kind of sick joke. But she didn't. Her expression remained calm and serious. "That's ridiculous," Jacob said finally, his voice shaking. "You're saying my girls are what? Aliens?" Ms. Albright's gaze didn't falter. "Not exactly. But their lineage includes genetic markers that are not of this earth." Jacob's head spun. He wanted to laugh, to yell, to tell this woman to leave his house. But then he thought about the things he couldn't explain, the lights, the whispers, the way Imani always seemed to know more than she should. "What does that mean for them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means they're special," Ms. Albright said, "but it also means they're at risk. There are others who would exploit their abilities if they knew the truth." Jacob's heart pounded. What kind of risk? Ms. Albright hesitated. "Let's just say you're not the only one who's noticed their uniqueness. It's imperative that you keep them safe and avoid drawing attention to their abilities." Jacob leaned back, running a hand through his hair. This was too much. He had signed up to be a father, to give these girls a home. He hadn't signed up for whatever this was. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked finally. "Be their father," Ms. Albright said simply. "Love them, protect them, and listen to them. They'll trust you when they're ready." Jacob's gaze drifted to the kitchen, where the girls were huddled together, whispering. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what would happen next. "I need time to process this," he said, his voice strained. Ms. Albright stood, closing her briefcase. "Of course, but remember, Mr. Walker, time is not always a luxury we have." With that she left, leaving Jacob standing alone in the living room, his thoughts racing. He knew one thing for sure, his life was no longer his own, and neither were his daughters. That evening, the house felt unusually quiet. The girls had gone to bed without much fuss, and the usual giggles and whispers coming from their rooms were replaced by an eerie silence. Jacob sat in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, his mind racing. Ms. Albright's words played over and over in his head. Genetic markers not of this earth. Extraordinary. At risk. He didn't know how to protect his daughters from something he didn't understand. What could he do against a threat he couldn't even name? And what exactly were they capable of? He had so many questions, but the answers seemed impossibly far away. Just as he was about to head upstairs to check on the girls, a soft knock at the front door startled him. His heart leaped into his throat. It was nearly midnight. Who could possibly be visiting at this hour? For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but something told him he couldn't. He approached the door cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. When he opened it, he found no one there, only the cold night air and the faint sound of rustling leaves. He stepped out onto the porch, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, the quiet suburban neighborhood as still as ever. But then he noticed it, a faint light glowing in the distance, just beyond the line of trees at the edge of his yard. It wasn't like any light he'd seen before. It shimmered, almost alive, pulsating softly. Jacob's chest tightened as he stared at it, a deep sense of unease settling over him. He turned back toward the house, intending to lock the door and ignore whatever was out there. But as he stepped inside, he froze. Amani was standing at the top of the stairs, her small figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice steady and calm. Jacob nodded slowly, his throat dry. "What is it?" "It's them," she said simply. Before Jacob could ask what she meant, the other girls appeared behind her, their faces somber. They moved as one, descending the stairs in silence. Amani led the way, her gaze fixed on the front door. "You shouldn't go out there," Jacob said, his voice rising with panic. "It could be dangerous." "It's already here," Amani said, her tone almost resigned. The glow outside grew brighter, spilling into the living room through the windows. Jacob felt a strange pull, like the light was calling to him, urging him to step outside. But the girls didn't seem afraid. They stood together in the middle of the room, their faces illuminated by the unnatural glow. "What's going on?" Jacob demanded, his voice trembling. "What aren't you telling me?" Amani turned to him, her expression serious. "We didn't choose this," she said, "but we have to face it." "Face what?" he asked desperately. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand, her grip firm despite her small size. The other girls joined her, forming a circle around Jacob. He could feel the air shift, the same charged sensation he felt before. Then, without warning, the light outside surged, filling the room with a blinding brilliance. Jacob shielded his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, a low hum reverberating through the walls. "What's happening?" he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising hum. The girls didn't flinch. They stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the door as if they were waiting for something, or someone. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the light disappeared. The hum faded, and the room plunged into silence. Jacob lowered his arm, blinking to adjust to the darkness. But the moment he looked at the girls, his breath caught in his throat. Their eyes were glowing again, brighter than before, and their expressions were eerily calm. Amani stepped forward, her gaze meeting his. "They're coming," she said softly. "Who's coming?" Jacob demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Amani hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The ones who left us behind," she said finally. Before Jacob could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house, louder and more insistent than before. This time, it wasn't at the front door, it was coming from the back. Jacob's pulse raced as he turned toward the kitchen, where the sound had originated. The girls stayed where they were, their eyes following him as he moved. "Stay here," he said firmly, his voice trembling. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and approached the back door, his steps slow and deliberate. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was growing impatient. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. He glanced back at the girls, who were still standing in the living room, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Taking a deep breath, Jacob unlocked the door and pulled it open. What he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. The cold night air rushed in as Jacob's eyes struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. Standing at the threshold was a man, at least, that's what Jacob thought at first. His figure was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs, and a face that seemed just slightly off. His features were too smooth, his eyes too large, glowing faintly with the same otherworldly light Jacob had seen in the girls. The man, or whatever he was, spoke, but not in words. A strange vibration filled the air, resonating inside Jacob's chest, as though the sound was meant to bypass his ears entirely. He stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to shut the door, to get the girls and run. "Jacob Walker." The figure said, the vibrations forming his name in Jacob's mind. "You have something that belongs to us." Jacob's heart pounded as he forced himself to respond. "They're not things," he said, his voice trembling. "They're my daughters." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the response. "They're not yours to keep," it said. "They were left here for a purpose, and that purpose has come to fruition. You have fulfilled your role." Jacob felt a surge of anger cut through his fear. "My role?" he spat. "I raised them, loved them. They're not some experiment you can take back when it's convenient." Behind him, the girls moved into the kitchen, their presence grounding him in the surreal moment. Amani stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, steadying. "Don't," she said softly. The figure's glowing eyes shifted to her, and for the first time, Jacob saw something like recognition flicker across its face. "Amani," it said, the vibration in its tone softer. "You know what must be done. Your time here is over." Amani's grip on Jacob tightened. "We're not going with you," she said firmly. The figure seemed to sigh, though the sound was more like a low hum. "You can't resist what you are," it said. "What we are. The others are waiting." "What others?" Jacob demanded, his protective instincts flaring. He stepped in front of Amani, shielding her from the figure. "You're not taking them anywhere." A sudden rush of wind filled the room, despite the stillness outside. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to expand, filling the space with an oppressive energy. The kitchen lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the figure's form seem even less human. "They're not meant for this world," it said, its voice echoing in Jacob's mind. "And neither are you." The words hit Jacob like a blow. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, its elongated fingers glowing with the same ethereal light. A strange energy crackled in the air, and Jacob felt an invisible force pull at him, tugging him toward the figure. He resisted, planting his feet firmly on the ground, but the sensation grew stronger. "No!" Amani shouted, stepping forward. The glow in her eyes intensified, and the pull suddenly stopped. The figure recoiled slightly, as if her defiance had caught it off guard. "You don't understand," it said, its tone shifting to something almost pleading. "Your place is with us. Your father." "He's our father now," Amani interrupted, her voice steady. The other girls moved closer, their small frames standing defiantly between Jacob and the figure. Zola's hands clenched into fists, and Tay glared at the figure with more courage than Jacob thought possible. The figure hesitated, its glowing eyes scanning the girls, then Jacob. "You've bound yourselves to him," it said, almost accusingly. "This was not the plan." "Plans change," Amani said. The figure's form flickered, as if struggling to maintain its shape. "You do not understand the consequences of this choice," it said. "The others will come. They will not be as forgiving." "Let them come," Amani said, her voice unwavering. Jacob felt a mix of pride and terror as he watched his daughters stand their ground. Whatever was happening, they were in it together. He didn't fully understand the stakes, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to lose his family. The figure took a step back, its form becoming less distinct. "You have made a grave mistake," it said, its voice echoing as it began to fade. "The world you know will not survive what comes next." And then it was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air and an unsettling silence. Jacob turned to the girls, his heart racing. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amani looked up at him, her glowing eyes dimming. "This isn't over," she said. "It's only the beginning." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jacob's mind raced with questions, but Amani and the others remained quiet, their expressions heavy with something he couldn't quite name. He wanted to press them, to demand answers, but the raw intensity of the moment held him back. He had never seen his daughters like this, so powerful, so united, and yet so burdened. A sudden sharp vibration shook the house, rattling the windows and knocking over a picture frame on the counter. Jacob spun around, half expecting the glowing figure to reappear. Instead, the air itself seemed to shift, rippling like water. A faint hum grew louder, and then the entire house was bathed in a blinding white light. The girls stepped closer to Jacob, forming a protective circle around him. "Hold on to us," Amani said, her voice steady but urgent. Jacob obeyed, clutching her hand tightly as the light grew so intense he had to shut his eyes. When he opened them, they were no longer in the kitchen. They stood in an endless expanse of white, the ground beneath their feet smooth and reflective like polished glass. The air buzzed with an unearthly energy, and the light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jacob turned in every direction, his heart pounding. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "This is their place," Amani said quietly. "Their domain." Before Jacob could ask who they were, figures began to materialize out of the light. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all tall and otherworldly like the one that had appeared at his door. Their glowing eyes fixed on the group, unblinking and intense. They formed a loose circle, surrounding Jacob and the girls, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. One of the figures stepped forward, taller than the rest, its light brighter and its form more defined. It spoke without words, the vibrations reverberating through Jacob's chest. "You have disrupted the balance," it said, addressing the girls. "Your bond with this human was not meant to be." "We chose him," Amani said, her voice unwavering. "He's our father." The leader's glow dimmed slightly, as if in contemplation. "Your choice has consequences," it said. "The energy within you was meant to align with us. By anchoring yourselves to this human, you have created an imbalance." Jacob stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding his fear. "They're not just energy or whatever you think they are. They're people, my daughters. You can't take them away." The leader turned its glowing eyes on Jacob, and for a moment he felt as if his very soul was being laid bare. "You do not understand what you have done," it said. "Their power is not theirs alone. It is connected to worlds, to life itself. If it remains tethered to this reality, it will unravel everything." Amani raised her chin defiantly. "We won't leave him," she said. "We can find another way." "There is no other way," the leader said. Its voice was resolute, final. The other figures began to hum, their combined energy creating a wave of heat that pressed down on Jacob and the girls. Jacob's mind raced. He didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but he knew he couldn't let them take his daughters. He tightened his grip on Amani's hand, feeling the warmth and strength there. "If there's no other way," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "then take me instead. Let them stay. I'll go." The leader paused, its glow flickering as if surprised. The other figures stilled, their humming ceasing abruptly. Amani turned to Jacob, her eyes wide. "No," she said, "we're not losing you." "It's the only way," Jacob said, his voice breaking. "I can't let them take you. I can't." The leader stepped closer, its towering form casting a shadow even in the blinding light. "You would sacrifice yourself for them?" it asked, its tone curious. "Without question," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. The leader seemed to consider this, its glow pulsing rhythmically. Then it turned to Amani and the others. "You have bonded with him in a way that defies our understanding. His willingness to give his life for yours has altered the balance." A ripple of light passed through the gathered figures, a silent exchange that Jacob couldn't comprehend. Finally, the leader spoke again. "Very well," it said, "the bond you share will remain, but it comes at a cost." "What cost?" Jacob asked, his voice worry. "The energy within them will stabilize," the leader said, "but it will tie them, and you, to forces beyond your control. You will not live an ordinary life. The path ahead will be fraught with danger. Jacob looked at his daughters, their glowing eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "We'll face it together," he said. The leader nodded, its light dimming as it stepped back. The other figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the surrounding brilliance. The hum in the air grew softer, and the white expanse began to blur. In an instant, they were back in the kitchen. The light was gone, the air still, as if nothing had happened. Jacob looked around, half expecting the figures to reappear, but the house was silent. The girls turned to him, their eyes no longer glowing, but filled with tears. Amani threw her arms around him, followed by the others, their small frames trembling as they clung to him. "It's over," Amani whispered. Jacob held them close, his heart heavy with relief and dread. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They were in this together, no matter what came next. But just as he began to breathe easier, a faint hum echoed in the distance, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a reminder that their story was far from over. The hum lingered in Jacob's mind long after it faded, a haunting reminder of the impossible reality they had just faced. The kitchen was eerily quiet, but the warmth of his daughters in his arms grounded him. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in an embrace that spoke of love, fear, and resilience. Whatever they had survived it together. Eventually, Zola pulled back, her small face pressed into his chest one last time before looking up. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jacob didn't have an answer. His mind spun with the weight of everything he had heard and seen. The girls were more than they seemed, more than he had ever understood, and yet, to him, they were still just kids. His kids. "We keep going," he said finally. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it. Together." The girls nodded, their faith in him evident in their tired, relieved expressions. Amani stepped away, her gaze distant as she looked out the kitchen window. "They'll come again," she said quietly, her words heavy with certainty. "Maybe not soon, but someday. They won't let this go." Jacob approached her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "We'll figure it out. We always do." The days that followed were strangely calm. Life seemed to return to its familiar rhythm. School drop-offs, homework, dinner conversations. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The girls were quieter, more thoughtful, as if the weight of what had happened still pressed on them. Jacob noticed it most in Amani, who often stared into space, lost in thought. One evening, as the other girls slept, Jacob found her sitting on the porch, her knees pulled to her chest. The cool night air swirled around them as he sat beside her. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Amani didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Do you think they were right? That we're dangerous?" Jacob's heart ached at the question. He had seen her bravery, her strength, and her unshakable love for her family. Dangerous wasn't a word he'd ever associate with her. "No," he said firmly. "You're not dangerous. You're special. There's a big difference." Amani looked at him, her eyes glistening. "But what if we hurt people? What if I hurt you?" "You won't," Jacob said, his voice steady. "Because I know your heart. You're a protector, Amani. Just like you protected me and your sisters. That's who you are." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I'm scared, Dad." "So am I," he admitted, wrapping an arm around her. "But being scared doesn't mean we stop. It means we keep going, even when it's hard." That quiet moment was interrupted by a faint flicker of light in the distance. Amani stiffened, her gaze locking on it. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Jacob followed her eyes, his chest tightening. The flicker was faint but unmistakable, a pulsing glow that seemed to hover just beyond the tree line. It wasn't menacing, at least not yet, but it was a reminder that their world was no longer as simple as it had once seemed. "Stay here," he said, rising to his feet. Amani grabbed his arm. "No, we face it together." He hesitated, then nodded. They woke the other girls, who joined them on the porch, their faces tense but resolute. Together, they watched the light grow brighter closer. But as it approached, its intensity dimmed, revealing something unexpected. It wasn't one of the glowing figures. It was a woman, human, or at least she appeared to be. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes, though glowing faintly, were warm and kind. She stopped a few feet from the porch, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Jacob Walker," she said, her voice calm and melodic. "Add Amani, Zola, Tay, Nia, and Layla. I mean you no harm." Jacob stepped forward, shielding the girls instinctively. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman smiled faintly. "My name is Alina. I'm like them, but different. I came to help." The girls exchanged uncertain glances, but Amani stepped forward, her chin lifted. "Why should we trust you?" she asked. "Because I chose a path like yours," Alina said. "I walked away from them long ago. I know what it's like to live between two worlds. I can teach you how to do the same." Jacob's protective instincts warred with his hope. "Why would you help us?" he asked. Alina's gaze softened. "Because I see what you've built here. Love, family, loyalty. Those things are rare, even among my kind. They're worth protecting." The tension in the air eased, though not entirely. Amani looked to Jacob, her expression questioning. He gave her a small nod, trusting her instincts. "We'll listen," she said. Alina stayed with them, weaving herself into their lives with a quiet grace. She told the girls how to control their abilities, how to channel their energy without letting it consume them. She also shared stories of her own journey, of the sacrifices she had made to choose humanity over the cold, calculated existence of the others. Over time, the girls grew stronger, not just in their abilities but in their confidence. They laughed more, argued about chores, and made plans for the future. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt full and real. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Alina shared a final piece of advice. "The others will come again," she said. "But when they do, they'll find something they don't expect, a family united by love and purpose. That's your greatest strength." Jacob looked around the table, at the faces of the girls he had fought so hard to protect, and felt a deep sense of peace. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Years later, as Jacob sat on the porch watching the girls, now young women, laugh and play in the yard, he reflected on how far they had come. The hum in the distance never truly disappeared, but no longer filled him with fear. It was a reminder of where they had been and how much they had overcome. In the end, they weren't defined by the glowing eyes or the mysterious forces that sought to control them. They were defined by the choices they made, the love they shared, and the strength they found in each other. And that, Jacob knew, was enough.